I think one of the things in life that can be hardest to reconcile is when reality fails to live up to our ideals. So ideals are, the perfect, almost suitable versions of people or things. And we hold to ideals in all sorts of areas of our lives, about what the perfect, almost suitable version of work or education or relaxation looks like. What the ideal politician or government or leader looks like and acts like. Of course, I don't have to tell you that it's extremely rare for reality to live up to the ideal. And so we constantly experience less perfect, less suitable versions of work or education or relaxation or leadership. And not only is the experience of that just hard, it actually affects how we view the ideal. Maybe it means that we view the ideal as necessary to hold on to and aim for at all costs, whatever the cost. But that can lead to despair as we time and again fail to reach it, time and again fail to experience. Or we may view the ideal as unreal, as just unrealistic, and that can lead to cynicism. The ideal is it's impossible to achieve. It's impossible to hold on to. There's no point in ever bother aiming for it. And no more is this true than in the area of relationships and marriage. Many of us hold to all sorts of ideals about relationships and marriage, about what they ideally will look like, about how they will work. Maybe our ideals are about, the place of romance in a marriage, or about our compatibility in marriage, whether we click as a couple, or about the dynamics of marriage, who will be responsible for X, who will make decisions about Y. But what about God? Is there such a thing as a marriage ideal according to God? And if so, what happens when reality fails to live up to that ideal? Do we reassess the ideal and abandon it? Or do we uphold it at all costs, whatever the cost? And these are all the questions that are addressed in this first part of Mark chapter 10. Jesus is asked his thoughts on divorce. And as he engages in response, we see this tension between ideal and reality. What is God's view of it all? What does it mean for us? And up front, I want to acknowledge that this is just a really hard subject to talk about. There are people here who carry the scars and maybe even the guilt of past relationships that have come to an end. Some of you right now are living in marriages that are incredibly difficult. And some of you might be caught in the middle of warring parents or warring families or warring friends. And so today may feel a little bit like salt being poured on an open wound. It's just painful. It causes you pain to even talk about and to think about. But please know that causing you pain is not my intention as a preacher, as one of your ministers, and it's certainly not the intention of the Lord Jesus. Now, my intention is to look at what the Bible has to say, to look at what Jesus himself has to say, talk plainly about it, so that whatever your marriage or your relationship experience is, whether you feel it's ideal or it's far from ideal, you might find truth and grace and hope in Jesus. Mark sets the scene for us in verse 1. Jesus is back in Judea, in the south. Crowds continue to flock to him. He continues to teach them. But the religious leaders, in this case the Pharisees, who have been growing in their hostility towards Jesus, they also come. And we're told they come in order to test Jesus. The topic they choose, divorce. Verse 2. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, earlier in Mark's gospel, he recounted the fact that John the Baptist was beheaded, in large part because he publicly rebuked King Herod for his divorce and remarriage to his brother-in-law's wife. It's possible the Pharisees are hoping the same will happen to Jesus. Certainly their motives aren't pure. That word translated test, it means to try out the defenses of or to catch unguarded. This is a gotcha question. There's a gotcha question for Jesus. How so? Well, at the time, there were two opposing schools of thought on divorce, and society was kind of split along these two schools of thought. And they were opposed in their interpretation of the divorce law, particularly as it was found in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. If a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something improper about her, he may write her a divorce certificate, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. The key debated phrase was something improper. What did that mean? And the more conservative Jews at the time, for them, something improper meant a sexual sin of some kind. That's what all it meant. But for the more liberal Jews at the time, something improper could refer to anything that displeases the husband. If the wife cooked a bad meal, if she talked to a man in the street. And so the Pharisees, they haven't come to Jesus about divorce, with the aim of greater and more godly understanding. Their sole aim in raising this sensitive issue is to get Jesus in trouble. It's to discredit him. So where does Jesus stand? Specific fault divorce? Any fault divorce? Or no divorce at all? Well, none of the above, actually. None of the above. Instead, Jesus' response can be put under two headings: permission and priority. Like a good teacher, Jesus answers the question with the question of his own. Verse 3, he replied to them, "What did Moses command you?" So they've come to him asking about what is lawful. And so Jesus says, well, what does the actual law of Moses say? And so now the Pharisees have to articulate their opinion on this subject. You'll notice before even Jesus has to. He's turned it around. And they stay on safe ground. They effectively just quote Deuteronomy 24. Verse 4, they said, Moses permitted us to write divorce papers and send her away. Basically, Moses made a clear rule with official steps. 1, write a certificate of divorce. 2, send her on her way. Case closed. What does Jesus make of their answer? Well, you'll notice he doesn't contradict it, but nor is he satisfied with it. Verse 5, he, that is Moses, wrote this command for you because of the hardness of your hearts. This command exists because human hearts are hard. The reality is that sometimes relationships are messy and they are broken, irreparably so, even among God's people. And so Jesus acknowledges that, yes, Moses permitted divorce, which means God permitted divorce. But why did he do so? Because of the hardness of your hearts, because of people's sinful heart issues. Sin lies at the root of every relationship breakdown. In an ideal world, divorce would not happen because people would be perfect and therefore the relationships they have would be perfect, all of them. But we don't live in an ideal world. We are imperfect people living in an imperfect world. We inhabit a broken reality. And in such a reality, in such a world, divorce exists. In fact, in certain horrible situations, divorce may be the only thing that can retrieve some good out of that horrible situation. Now, what situations are those? They're not outlined here. We'll look at a couple shortly. But Jesus' point is that, yes, divorce is permitted, but it's not promoted. Divorce is permitted, but it's not promoted. And it's not promoted because there's a priority. And to show this priority, Jesus goes even further back than Deuteronomy. He goes back to the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. Yes, Jesus says, through Moses, God gave you permission to divorce. But, verse 6, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, man must not separate. Jesus' point is that God has designed men and women to be uniquely and lastingly joined this way in marriage. And so separating them, that is a big deal. It's a big deal. It's something that no one should proactively seek. And then Jesus doubles down on this in verses 10 and 12. So after the discussion on the road, he and his disciples end up in a house and they ask him some follow-up questions. And Jesus goes on to say, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Also, if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And so Jesus teaching on the priority of marriage, it naturally takes in a related issue, remarriage. And taken at face value, Jesus seems to be saying here that any remarriage by a divorced person is tantamount to adultery, to marital unfaithfulness. Is that quite what Jesus is saying? Well, not quite. As we've already seen, Jesus agrees that divorce is lawful under God. And we'll look at a couple of specifics shortly. Now, what Jesus is primarily addressing here in his answer to the disciples is a culture which granted far more freedom to men than it did to women. You'll notice that the divorce certificate could only ever be issued by the man. It was never the other way around. And so Jesus is pushing back against a culture that basically gave men the right to divorce their wives on a whim. And by doing so, he's radically elevating the status of the wife to the same dignity as the husband, while at the same time placing the husband under an obligation of fidelity. They are both equally under an obligation of fidelity. That's Jesus' starting point. This is his priority, because it's God's priority to promote the ideal of marriage as a uniquely God-given lifelong union between a man and a woman. And being reminded of the ideal is good. Not so that we feel bad about our own unideal marriages, but so that we make a priority of maintaining them as much as possible. The ideal helps us to keep divorce as a last resort when all possible options have been exhausted. That's what the ideal does. That's Jesus' priority here. But what about when you do reach the last resort, when all possible options have been exhausted? What constitutes permissible grounds for divorce in God's eyes? Well, broadly speaking, there are two passages which speak to this. In Matthew chapter 19, Matthew records the same conversation that Jesus is having here in Mark chapter 10. But he includes a couple of extra bits of teaching on Jesus, one of which is where Jesus outlines specifically that adultery, sexual activity with anyone who isn't your husband and wife, is a grounds for divorce. And in our time, possibly the constant use of pornography would qualify as well. Because adultery isn't just an affair. That's the word that gets used, doesn't it, in our culture? It just tries to sanitize what it is, but it's not. It's a betrayal of intimacy and trust. It is a deliberate break of your covenant promise to love and cherish and honor your spouse. And so it affects you. It affects your spouse. It affects whatever children you might have. It affects your wider family and your friends. And it is completely understandable that in the face of such betrayal of trust and intimacy, a wife or husband says, I can no longer be married to you. And it's reasonable to pursue divorce in such a situation. Now, having said that, even with adultery, when you look at Matthew 19, divorce isn't prescribed by Jesus, like it's an automatic thing. And so while acknowledging the deep betrayal and loss of trust that adultery brings, I would still encourage couples to get help, to see if the relationship is at all salvageable before calling it quits. But that is one grounds that Jesus outlines, adultery. And the other one is abandonment. And we see this particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 from the Apostle Paul. And Paul says, if your spouse walks out and refuses to come back, then you are no longer bound to them. By abandoning you, they have abandoned their vows. And so there's no practical way of restoring the relationship if they have permanently turned their back on that marriage. And so you are free to divorce. You are free to remarry in that circumstance. In fact, this is the position of the Sydney Anglican Diocese, that divorce is permitted in cases where, quote, the other partner has decisively repudiated the original relationship. Decisively repudiated. turn their back on it and want nothing more to do with it. Now, there's still, debate about what constitutes abandonment. Is abandonment only ever physical, like you've physically got to leave the place, that's what constitutes it? Or is there emotional abandonment? We've just disconnected and don't want to engage for a long, long time. What about domestic abuse? Does that count? What if I'm forced to abandon my marriage for my safety? Does that mean I've abandoned it in a sinful way? Well, the short answer to that is no. My view, and it's also the view of the Sydney Anglican Diocese, is that domestic violence in all its forms is abandonment. That is, it's the abuser who has abandoned his or her covenant promises to love and cherish and honour their spouse. And so maybe you need to hear that this morning. If a husband or wife is forced to flee a marriage for safety, they have not abandoned. They have been abandoned. They have been abandoned. And so they are the two grounds that are outlined in the Bible. They're two horrible situations, and you can understand why the provision for divorce is made in that situation. But it's challenging teaching. Jesus' teaching is challenging here. It's challenging just to our brokenness. In part because Jesus' teaching just seems fairly black and white. He certainly sets a high bar for what constitutes valid divorce. And so this is just hard for the person whose marriage experience has seen them fall short of that high bar, of that ideal. And even if we as a church and as individual Christians are able to be as sympathetic and compassionate as possible and not stigmatize those who have gone through divorce, a divorced person may hear Jesus' words here and just experience pain, because divorce is painful. It's a challenge to our brokenness. But Jesus' words are arguably even more challenging, I would say, not to our heartaches, but to our deeply held assumptions, especially around rights and freedoms. Sometimes we advocate for rights because we see them as essential, as part of some universal common good. But there are also times when we advocate for rights because it suits us personally. We want the freedom just to do what we want. That might include just getting out of our marriages. We see this in our culture's approach to forming intimate relationships. So it's no surprise that we also see it in our culture's attitude towards ending our intimate relationships. We have the right to be happy, don't we? Whatever that means. Therefore, we have the right to free ourselves from whatever situation isn't giving us true happiness, and to do so without hassle. And that was what had happened with any fault divorce in Jesus' day. It was dressed up as an essential right for the common good, but at heart it was about what was personally advantageous. Mainly, that men wouldn't have to be held to any inconvenient obligations of fidelity. And whatever people's motives for pursuing divorce, the statistics strongly suggest that there is a connection between no-fault divorce and more divorce. In 1974, there were about 12,000 divorces, and that had been fairly consistent in the years and decades leading up to that. When no fault was introduced the next year, that doubled to more than 24,000. And the year after that, more than doubled again to 63,000. Since then, it's flattened out about 50,000 a year. And while this change may well have made it easier for some genuine victims to end their harmful marriages more easily, in most cases, it isn't them who contribute to those statistics. In most cases, it isn't the betrayed and the abandoned and the abused who jump at the chance to end their marriage. It's the husband or wife who just wants what he or she wants and is unwilling to compromise. It's the husband or wife who flings up his or her arms and says it's all too hard without genuinely exploring all the options. And we have to acknowledge that the categories of no-fault divorce, irreconcilable differences, incompatibility, too much conflict, they can hide a multitude of sins. Ruth Baker, who was for a couple of years a member of this church, who herself is divorced and who writes a lot on these issues from a biblical perspective. She writes that Many of these reasons for divorce are arguably factors that would perhaps have been worked on if there was a will to restore the marriage and divorce were not so easy. And perhaps that is the key. No-fault divorce means you don't need to have the will to restore things. We need to have the will to restore things because marriage is hard. It's why you make solemn vows when you get married. But as a genuine lifelong partnership, marriage is also a great blessing, which is why you work hard to keep those vows, especially when it's hard. And so Jesus' teaching here, as he elevates the ideal, can be very challenging to that sense of autonomy that says, I just want to do what I want, when I want, and how I want. Lastly, Jesus' teaching is a challenge to his own church, to us. The church has a part to play in all this, certainly to support marriages as much as possible in God's purposes for them, to remain lifelong unions. And to that end, we can and we should do things like provide meaningful support, certainly as brothers and sisters in Christ, but as leadership in the form of teaching and counseling, in the form of really helpful things like marriage enrichment courses, and supporting marriages by being open about the challenge of marriage and not stigmatizing those who are willing to work on the difficulties in their marriage and face them headlong. You know, almost every medical expert agrees that prevention is better than cure. And I can certainly say that most of the marriages that I have known to break down could arguably have been saved, significantly helped, if there'd been some sort of earlier intervention. But by the time it emerged that they were in difficulty, it was mostly a matter of triaging the damage. There's only so much that can be done at that point. And so as a church, we need to be careful about demonizing divorce in a way that's unhelpful. I mean, the fact is we live in a fallen world that on all manner of fronts, fails to live up to the ideals. You know, in our attitudes to money and wealth, in our pursuit of enjoyment, in our stewardship of God's creation. We were discussing this earlier in the week as a staff team. And Mike just pointed out that Jesus goes way harder on the disciples about their pride and self-glorying attitude than he does on the subject of divorce. If you look back to that, it's pride and self-glory that Jesus speaks plainly about the danger of going to hell, not here. And so as much as Jesus' teaching challenges all those who are considering divorce in one way or another, or who are divorced, it's also a challenge to those who will respond to divorced people. Because from the way that some churches treat divorced persons, you would think that they had committed the unpardonable sin. But there's actually no such thing. We know that in our heads, but it's so much harder to live out. One writer says, even if someone has wrongly obtained a divorce, it's a sin in that sense. Precisely because it's a sin, it is forgivable. And so they too can be forgiven, cleansed, and restored to Christ's church. We must not call unclean those whom God has cleansed. And God has cleansed us through the work of Jesus on the cross and through his resurrection to new life. He has cleansed us from guilt and shame, from the penalty of sin and the power of sin. In Jesus, there is no condemnation. So God's people don't condemn you or shouldn't. See, the cross reminds us what God has done to restore our broken relationship with him. It's a motivation. The cross is also empowering. It transforms us. We are people restored to God, and so we can help restore others. And so if the cross remains at the center of our identity and at the center of our community, then we will have both the motivation and the power for pursuing the ideal of marriage in the face of difficulty and for responding with compassion and healing for those whose marriages are in difficulty or have ended. And speaking of responding in practical terms, you know, one of the ways is the divorce care course. This is a video-based support group program where people come alongside you as you process the pain of separation and divorce and seek to heal from it. We've run it here in the past. Mark, Bullen, and Mike have run it. We're going to run it again at some point in the future. If that's something that will be helpful for you, they would love to hear from you and to come alongside you to support you in that way. The Pharisees' question, aside from being a gotcha question, aside from being an attempted trap, it's just disappointingly shallow. Is divorce lawful? You're only going to get a surface level answer to that question that fails to take into account God's ultimate purpose for human flourishing, that fails to take into account spiritual and pastoral complexity of living in a fallen world. The reality of life is that people do make bad choices. They break the trust and fundamental oneness of marriage, often to the point of permanent deterioration of marriage. In a fallen world, Christians have to find ways of showing the deep, compassionate sympathy of Jesus, an understanding of Jesus towards those for whom life has not turned out according to the highest ideal. And in a fallen world, we have to do what we can to help marriages be what God designed them to be, as partnerships that go the distance, not out of sheer bloody-mindedness, just because I have to, whatever the cost, but out of a genuinely committed love, a love that's expressed in humbling the self, in honouring the other, to the glory of God.